My name's Anita Ellis of Hillside Quilting and welcome to my favourite quilty things talk. What I'm going to share with you today is a heap of advice which I have developed over years of using different things to do the job of machine quilting. Now, just to let you know, I'm not paid to do any of this. I never receive free samples. These are just things that I truly believe in that work. And so you can try them and use them yourself and be assured that they do the job. I think in our industry, as in most industries, there's people who love gadgets and will have every single gadget going, and there's people who want just the bare minimum and don't want to sort of buy into that gadget world. And that's fine, we need everybody in this world. So I think I sort of sit much more towards the non-gadget end, because I think so many things will double up and do different things, and then there's certain times when, this does the job, and that's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to say, yeah, you could buy this, you could buy that, but no, get that and it does the job. And that's what I'm about. You don't have to write notes or anything what I'm gibbering about, because you'll get a class handout which has all the information. Pretty much what I tell you is written down in sort of short form, because I can talk a lot. So don't worry about that, just sit back, relax and listen in. I'll start talking about the pins I don't like, which I've just got in here. These are the yellow-headed daggers that people bring to class sometimes, and they just don't work. They're too big, they're too chunky, they don't bend, and they're not a help to you at all. So we don't like using those. What I do like using are the glass head pins, which is a picture on the screen. And this is them, and they've got some flex in them. Put it there. They've got some flex in them. They're much finer, and you can still got a decent head, so you can get hold of them. But they just feel beautiful in the work, so that's really good. And that's what I like. And they're a good price point too. They're not too expensive. There are pins that are maybe a tiny little bit better, but they're like 3 or 4 times the price. Well, these ones are good value and work brilliantly. So that's what I like. They're the silk head pins, and they work really well. Onto machine quilting needles. I use 2 different types of machine quilting needle. I use the superior top stitch ones, and I use the purple tip needles. A couple of different pros and cons with both of them. With the superior ones, they last longer than the purple tip ones, and they solve a lot of problems because they don't deflect and they keep nice and straight in the work when you're working. They come in different thicknesses, so you get 70, 80, 90s and 100s. So the 70 I'll be using for piecing, the 80 and 90 I will be using for my quilting, perhaps an 80 if it was a thinner thread, and a 90 would be my sort of go-to, and then the 100 if it was a really thicker thread that I was using. So they're a good versatile needle to use. The Janome purple tip needles are fantastic if you're having machine quilting issues. Say potentially your threads are shredding, you're finding you're getting skip stitches when you go in certain directions. The Janome purple tips will solve all those problems. They're really, really good. The only thing about them is they don't last as long as their titanium ones. And so they're a little bit cheaper, but it would be nice if these lasted as long, but they solve so many problems. They're pretty much my go-to needle most of the time. Depending on the machine, if I know I've got like a perfect machine and it's not going to give me any grief, then I might well use the superior ones over these, but generally these are my go-to needle for that purpose. Self-threading needles. I really love the Matilda's Own ones to thread in my ends when I'm doing my quilting. I nearly always thread in my finishes. When it's the starts, if I'm not going to be going over it a couple of times with my quilting, then I thread those starts in too. I'm going to pop a little video on for you to show you how I do that, and so and I'll come back to you. Now the first thing we're going to show you is how to do the starts and stops. So you're going to needle down, needle up, move the fabric away so you can bring the loop up, pull the loop, come back over the existing hole where you are, then you're going to go do a couple of stitches up and down, give the thread a little waggle whilst it's doing it, and then that holds it securely. Now when you start stitching, make sure you hold this loop, and then we'll do a little bit of stitching, and then we're going to do a stop. Okay, so when we do a stop, what we want to do is bring the threads up so that they're all on the top. We don't want threads hiding behind underneath, because if that's going to happen, what happens is that those threads end up getting trapped and messed up and making bird nests in your work. So the first thing we're going to do is do needle up, bring the work away, hold that loop, bring that loop out, then go needle down again, in the same hole and up again, and then this brings up the bobbin from underneath. Quick snip through that loop and of this main thread. Then as you pull away, there's nothing underneath, nothing to get trapped. See that there? Nothing to be trapped underneath. Okay, so then what I would do then with those starts and stops is I would thread those ends in. I'm using self-threading needles. The last thing you want to do is, when you're doing your quilting, is to use the scissor function on your sewing machine, because what that does is it cuts these ends off really short so you can't bury them in. So I've got two ends on the top of my work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle through the first hole, through the sandwich. You might want to then have a look at the back just to make sure it's not gone through. Then I tie a knot underneath the needle. One thread goes under the needle, one at the other side, tie a knot, thread those through, thread both those ends so that they go through the eye of the needle, the self-threading needle, remember? And we've got those both through that self-threading needle, so it's a new needle, so it's a bit tight. They're those Goldilocks things. When you first use them, they're a bit tight, and then when they've been using them for a while, they're a bit loose, so they're just perfect for a little while. Pull those through, give it a tug so the knot goes in, use your scissors, chop that off, and away you go, all threaded in. Practice that lots and lots of times, so then you will get actually better at it and you won't need to worry about it. And if you do it even when you're just practicing your quilting, not even when you're actually doing real quilting, it's a much better way to actually get it into your head. So, okay, let's talk about bobbins. All machines use them. No one's ever come up with a machine that's got that everlasting bobbin. We all get cross when we've got to swap them over. The one thing that with bobbins you've got to watch out for is if you have a couple of different machines, even the same brand can have this issue, they may use different bobbins. So keep them separate, because if you don't, what will happen is you'll end up spending hours and hours and hours trying to fix a machine that really only needs a different bobbin. Ask me, I've done it. You know, it's very easy to forget something like that, so keep them separately. The other thing to think about bobbins is always wind a nice tight bobbin. You don't want a bobbin that looks sort of cone shaped, because it'll never feed off properly. And you don't want to overfill them, because if you overfill a bobbin, it spools off when it's inside the machine and then comes unthreaded. So little things like that really sort of matter with bobbins. And yeah, so wind them well. Make sure they're not spooling, and make sure they're tight enough, because the loose bobbin means it's not being put through all the tension discs properly when you've been winding it, and so that's never going to give you good results with your work. So that's really, be careful with your bobbins. Next up are quilting gloves. Quilting gloves, I find, sort of split people. Some people love them, some people hate them. What I've done, I've found the best glove that I can for the job that we do. And the job that we want those quilting gloves to do is to hold your fabric as you move. And I mean as you move. Some gloves are too loose. And if a glove is loose, what happens is the fabric of the glove moves prior to the fabric that of your sandwich that goes. So it kind of isn't as easy to be as accurate. So the ones that I love are my grabberoos. And they come in different sizes, which is good, because we all have different size hands. And because, well, that's important, because some things are one size and one size doesn't always fit all. So I wear a medium, and I like the gloves to be really tight for the reason I've just said, so that the gloves move. Those who know me or have been observant will see I've just nipped the top end of the thumb and the forefinger out. That's so that it gets around that issue of what's the most annoying thing about when you've got your gloves on? Playing with your threads and rethreading things or changing the bobbin. But because you've got these fingers free, you can do that and not have to take your gloves off and on. So most of my students end up doing this. Maybe not the first time they buy them, because it's quite funny sometimes to go, oh, I've just paid good money for those gloves and they're really good and I'm not cutting them up. But by the next class, they've always cut those little ends off, and it makes a big difference. So yeah, so nice tight gloves, they really help. Now look, you might have a different alternative, but that's my alternative, and I think they're really cool. Not expensive and last forever, and also they're reversible, so I can actually put this. So if you end up being a massive quilter and you end up wearing out the dots on one side, you just change them to the other. And you've got the dots on the other side. So they last a long, long time, which again is good value. You know, it's all about value. There's one thing that I use when I'm quilting that if I forget to put it on my machine, I really notice a difference. The day before I might have been quilting beautifully and having a lovely old time, and then they get up in the morning, you've changed your bobbin or you've done something, and then you haven't put your slippy mat back on. And then you're going along, you're thinking, oh, this is just hard work. It's not fun. And it is the slippy mat that makes a massive difference to how your work moves. So you need that to have no friction so that everything just glides. So you've got the friction from your glove on top of your fabric, but then underneath you've got the glide of the mat underneath. So the brand that I really love is the So Slip mat. Been around for a long time, and I think they are the best ones I use. They just work brilliantly. All of the mats are all about the same price. It's not a price element at all, but I just think they work and they last a long time. What you need to do is, this is what they look like, and you have the hole that goes over the feed dogs, because often when we quilt with the feed dogs up, feed dogs down. So I like this big square so that you can do that. Whereas if you've got the little circle on some of them, I usually end up cutting it out anyway, because then you can bring the feed dogs up and it doesn't chew away at the mat. But yeah, so when they're brand new, they're all really slick and they grip really well. But after a while, they get really linty because we pull them off and on, and some people just leave them on their extension table more or less permanently and move the extension table off and on, and that's sometimes quite a good idea. But after a while they get linty. So then I've had phone calls, people say, oh, I need a new mat, it won't stick. You don't need a new mat. What you need to do is wash it. So literally just put a little bit of washing up liquid, give it a wipe over and run it off under a cold tap, and then just waggle it dry. I always have the joke that makes a laugh is don't then go and use a tea towel to dry it, because that will have lint on it. So there you go. So yeah, just waggle it dry and pop it back on your machine, and they'll last a long time. The other thing too is to make sure if your machine, say your machine extension table just comes up to here and you end up with this bit of a flap happening, rather than letting the flap happen, two things you can do is you can tape it down with some blue tape, like just blue painter's tape, or trim it off and then it won't flap and then it won't lift up. So that's something else that you can do. So yeah, my So Slip mat's brilliant. Really, really useful. Like I say, if you don't put it on, you'll know about it. Yeah, okay. Now, I know some of you are waiting for those big topics of threads and marking pens. I'm saving those to the end because what we'll do is have a Q&A session, and I always get the most questions about those. So we'll save my description of those to the end and then lead into that. So spray basting your quills is a really quick way of making sure that your quilt is held down everywhere. So if you think about it, if you thread baste or you pin baste, your quilt is only held in the point where that pin is or that thread is. Whereas if you spray baste, it's held everywhere. At every point on the quilt is held by that light tack of the glue when it's holding it together. Now I know some people will say, oh, I don't want glue, it gums up the needles, it's, yeah, I'm not happy with it. It smells, it's this, that and the other. I have found the 505 is the most user-friendly one that I've had, and also it works the best in my opinion. You use some of them and it kind of doesn't stick, whereas the 505 generally sticks really well with everything, and you only need a really light spray. One bottle will last you so long. I did have a lady who came to class one day, came back the next day, said, oh, I've done one quilt, I need another bottle of spray. We needed to do a bit of re-education. You only need a very light spray. So when you're spraying as well, don't be spraying, oh, you know, la-di-da-di-da. Make sure your bottle is facing down, and then you're going to move quickly along and spray. Now, spray the centre part of your quilt first, or the piece that you're quilting. At some point, I will do another lesson on how we actually do the basting process with the spray base. But for now, let me just explain. When you're spraying, you want to move. You're not moving this speed. You're moving at this speed. So if you imagine this is our quilt, you're going to spray the middle part first, because you can always go back and put a little bit more on the edges. Whereas if you overspray, you end up with the glue on the wadding where there isn't a quilt. So just bear that in mind when you're doing your spraying. So spray pointing down, not like that, because if you spray like that, if you think about it, the spray is just going to go here, it's going to go here, it's going to go on your clothes. Or if you go like that, it's going on your quilt, all right? And then just light. Move, you know, reasonably fast across your space. Yep, so that's the 505 spray base, which I think is the easiest way to baste your quilts, and particularly for ruler work. When you're doing ruler quilting, it's really nice not to have anything in the way. So when you're doing ruler work, because you haven't got anything in the way, it just goes much quicker and much more smoothly, and you don't get the puckers underneath, because that's the other thing. If you're pin basting, sometimes you get puckers underneath. Maybe the pin didn't go all the way through properly. This way you've got the spray base on the back and the front, and everything just glides and doesn't pucker up. A small thing but a really useful thing is that 3 metre measuring tape, because by being so long you can use it for measuring big long lengths of backing fabric, or you know, your pieces when you're cutting them off when your ruler's not long enough. You can do conversions, which is what I use this for all the time. As I write patterns and things for the US market and the Australian market, I'm constantly doing conversions. So I think, oh, there's a yard. How much is that? Oh, that's 92 centimetres. Or, you know, our fabric is 42 inches wide, and so that's this. So I'm constantly flipping and starting. So it's a little thing, but don't ever let that measuring tape make its way into the shed, because it's yours and you'll use it all the time. I'm going to talk about irons now. So I've got my little travel iron, which I love, and it's nice and convenient when I'm travelling around to classes, which isn't happening too much at the moment. And then I've got my big home iron. I don't buy the most expensive, but I don't buy the cheapest iron. I buy this one that's the mid-price one that's good value. The one thing I do look for a feature in an iron is to make sure it turns itself off if it's not been used for a while. It's a big power saver, but it's also adds for longevity to the iron too, because it's not on all the time, and it's a safety feature as well. I don't have those irons that are laid like that, and then so they're on the fabric and then they go and then lift up. I don't have those here, because there's a lot of different people in my studio come through, and I find that mid-price iron suits everybody, and I can replace them, and they're not so expensive. But I do know that it's all about the habits that you get into. So I know I just do what I do and turn it upside down. I do know that sometimes if students have got those irons that stay down like that and then pull up, they've actually sort of left them on the mat and forgotten. And it's like, what's that smell? So I have to keep an eye out on that one to make sure that people aren't used to just leaving it down and it lifting up. So that's something else to think about when you get your iron. The most important thing, I think, is to make sure it comes up to a good heat, and also that it turns itself off if you've not used it for a while. I once sent my hubby out to buy me an iron because mine had broken, and he came back with one that didn't turn itself off. That iron didn't last any length of time at all, because it was permanently on all day as opposed to stopping and starting, and so not using all its elements up so much. So yeah, that's just something to think about. The wool felt ironing mats I love. I think they've almost replaced the need to have a great big ironing board, because as long as you've got a spare table, you can just lay them on the table and do what you want to do. This is a piece that I've cut off from my big mat, which I use just when I'm doing sampling and demonstrations and what have you. But yeah, no, it's a really nice surface, gets really nice seams. Do be careful to make sure you protect your table underneath it. And so yeah, you can't go wrong with these. You'll see on the website I've put up the Matilda's Own one, which is an Australian made one. You've got to be careful with any industry, particularly in our industry. There's a lot of copies out there of things, so you've got to make sure, I think, that we can buy Australian, because if you can, it's a great way to do it, or to buy from the original designers of things, because if you buy sort of knockoffs and copies, you might save yourself a few bucks along the way, but what will happen is that people will stop designing things or inventing things or putting out new patterns, because people are just copying them, and it's not fair, and it's best to keep that to the original designers of things. That's my opinion. Okay, lecture over. Going to talk about rotary cutters. One of the most important things about rotary cutters are its safety features. Now, at this point, I'm not going to say you must have this rotary cutter, because rotary cutters are so personal to your hand, how you like them, how they work for you. So these ones work for me and I really love them, but you try what works for you. This is really important that it works for your hand. I like the safety features on these because it clicks off, you do your work, you've got the thumb point there, which is nice and comfortable, and then you just click it off and it's safe. I have seen a couple of injuries that need to have plastic surgery and stuff, so they're dangerous things, these things, in the wrong hands or being used inappropriately. So do be careful, because they can cause a lot of damage if you don't use them properly. So yeah, so I tend to use the 45 one most of the time, although I do have a nice big 60, which I do use for big cuts and wadding and things like that. I usually keep one just for wadding, so that I just always use it for that. Sometimes what I do with all my cutters is, once the blades have become dull or nicked or whatever it might be, I take the blades off and I use them in another cutter, which I use for paper. And then, so they go through the sort of the cycles of what they get used for, and they finally end up, the blades get used for paper before they get tossed. Do get into the habit of putting your blade into the safety mode so that there's no risk of hurting yourself with that blade. In terms of cutting mats, I have a couple of different sizes. When I travel, I'll sometimes use the square rotating ones or the round ones. But I've also discovered these recently, which are lovely because they're folding cutting mats, and so that they're really well made, and then when they open, they're a decent sized mat. And because, again, this is important, it's a great feature. It's a sort of a jaggedy, wiggly line, so that when it gets put together, it hasn't got the join in exactly the same place all the way through, it's really nifty. It's a very well designed product. I use that a lot. The other thing I have at home is, well, I have either one or two big cutting mats, so that I can do really nice big long lengths on that. That will depend on how much room you've got at home, because I'm very fortunate. I have a great big space, and so I can have my big mats laid out. So yeah, so make sure the mat that you choose for home fits in the space. There's no point thinking, oh, I'll get that great big one. But again, if you're just on the corner of the kitchen table, then that great big one might not be the right thing for you. The most important thing with cutting mats is that you keep them flat. They warp in the sun and in heat, something rotten. And so they're not cheap things. You want to get a nice, good quality self-healing mat, but you want to make sure you store it flat. So store it on a table, store it on the floor under a bed. Don't leave your mats sort of up vertically. Store them horizontally so that they stay flat. Super important. I want to talk to you about cutting rulers. Okay, I'm not going to talk about particular brands. It's like I said, I'm not a brand specific person, but it's more about the markings and making sure you can see what you're cutting, and making sure that your lines can be accurate. So you can get the sort that have got this thicker blue line, Now I found those a bit tricky to see and be super duperly accurate with, so that wouldn't be my first choice. Having said that, this does get used in my home to do my cutting. Just happens to be my 12.5 inch square that I use all the time, but it's not my personal choice to have big thick lines. I like nice thin lines. Another one too is the yellow. Often our rulers are yellow, but this has got nice thin lines which are etched in, which is important. And just make sure that you can see through the yellow well enough on your fabric. But on your class notes, I've detailed the different sizes that I use the most, so I don't think I need to go through that here again. You don't need loads, just get 2 or 3 that work well for you in your style of patchwork that you like to do, and also the space that you've got. The one thing I would say is I love a big square ruler. 15 inches square or 20 inches square, brilliant. I use it all the time for all sorts of things. So get the biggest square your space can use, but there's no point in you getting a big 20-inch one if you're only working on a corner of the dining table. So you've got to make sure it works for your space too. Cameras. I love photography, I think almost as much as I love quilting, and so I have some really nice cameras. I use really good digital SLRs to do all my filming, and yeah, I'm very fortunate to have those, and it's sort of a big passion of mine too. But I also use my iPhone. I use my iPhone all the time just for little snaps of what I'm doing, and it's always on you as well, so I don't always take my great big digital SLR out with me, but I've always got my phone on me, so I'm taking inspiration shots wherever I go. And I've got great folders of photos that are going to inspire me to make all these quilts that I make in this lifetime, next lifetime, and the lifetime after that, I reckon. The other thing that I use my camera for a lot is if I'm doing a big quilt and I've decided the design I'm going to do, and I've done the first motif or whatever it is, I'll take a photo of it, so then I can have it next to me on my phone as the picture. I don't then have to hunt through the quilt, oh, where is that motif that I was trying to replicate? So I can just look at my phone and think, oh yeah, that's what it looks like, and go ahead and do it again. So a camera's really good for that purpose as well, not just for inspiration. I don't know what we did before we had phones with cameras on. I remember when they first came out, I thought, what do I need a camera on my phone for? Now, I wouldn't be without it. I use it all the time for recording inspiration, recording what I'm doing on my quilts, all sorts of different things. In fact, my kids think my phone's full of very, very boring photos, all of quilts. Skirt hangers, what a weird thing to bring into a quilting talk. But they're something that I use all the time. Behind me here is pretty much the biggest wall I've got in my room, and I've got beautiful light, lots of glass, but just nowhere to hang anything. So that's where skirt hangers come in. I use skirt hangers to either hang up full quilts, and I can hang up, big ones with lots of different hangers on them. So I just hang them on the rails around the windows so that I can keep things tidy, or also, be able to stand back and look at things. The other things that I use skirt hangers for is just to hold blocks together, and again just hang them up so that they don't get creased up and have to repress them every time you look at them. And that's also useful as well when you go into classes. If it says, oh, start your fabric and bring it ready to cut, start it, hang it on there, and you're ready to go. No folding up in the box, it's just all ready to go. So yeah, there's my weird one, skirt hangers, but a very useful thing. I'm going to talk to you about thread now. This is pretty much second only to marking pens that I get asked about all the time. Again, it's not brand specific. I will just say I do sell the glide thread because I think it's the best one for the job of machine quilting. My absolute favourite piecing thread is Orifil, the 50 weight, which comes on the orange spool. It's a beautiful fine cotton, and I tend to use cotton for piecing. Polyester and other fibres I'll use for my quilting, but cotton for the piecing, because you don't want that strain of a strong thread in the actual seam, but it's okay when it's all going over the surface because it's not going to make anything break. But cotton 50 weight is my favourite for piecing, and the Orifil is just a beautiful thread for that. The other thing I occasionally use for piecing is bottom line. This is a stronger polyester thread, and so it's potentially is just a little bit too strong for piecing, but it's also super fine. And so what that means is that Your seams won't have any bulk in it from the thread, so they will be perfect. So I do use that for piecing too. See, when you have polyester, it's strong. When you have cotton, it's weak. Right, and so you use the property of whatever the thread's got. When a thread is weaker, that's gonna, if somebody decides to try and pull a quilt apart, or you sit on it really hard and pull the seams, the thread will break before the fabric sort of tears and frays. So the thread will break first before the fabric does. If you use a stronger polyester in your seams, that is going to break after your fabric, so potentially that might cut through your fabric. Look, it's very unlikely this would ever happen, but that's the theory behind it. So I do use the bottom line as a nice fine one, but I also predominantly tend to use Aurifil 50 weight for piecing. I tend to use a 40 weight for most of my machine quilting. So one of the ones I use occasionally is Aurifil 40 weight, which is in a green spool, as opposed to an orange one, which is a 50 weight, which I would use for piecing. So that's a really nice thread. It's got a beautiful luster. It just looks beautiful. It's not the cheapest option. And I sort of suppose I use that in really nice sort of heritage quilts. But my main thread that I use for quilting is the Glide. Now the Glide is a polyester, but it runs through the machine beautifully. If you're ever having problems with a thread or the machine and it's not doing what it's supposed to do, swap over to a Glide thread and a purple tip needle and then see what happens, because you will not know yourself. It makes things so much easier, and it's got a beautiful luster to the quilting that you do, and it comes in a fabulous range of colours. On the website, I put together a collection of colours in the Glide that I know are really useful colours to use every day. So there's linen, which is a slightly off white colour. So it's not white, but it's not cream, but it's just sort of in between. And that's great for white quilts, cream quilts, and all sorts of things. I very rarely use a pure white. It's got Shadow, which is a very dark charcoal. Again, I kind of use that more so than I would use black. It's got Celery, which is a soft green, which can go on country greens, it can go on lime greens. It's got a really kind of chameleon thing. It works very well in traditional and modern sort of settings. Cool Grey 3, which is a silvery colour. It's not a metallic, but it looks like a metallic when you're quilting it, and it looks really, really nice. And then there's, what's the other one? Oh, Sand. How could I forget Sand, my favourite. It's like a soft gold colour. You can see there's pictures of all these on the website, and the colours are very well reproduced on there, so you can really see what they are. So I put those together as a little collection, so you can take those and try them, and they'll cover lots of situations of your quilting. So that's Glide. Goes through really nicely. I usually use the purple tip needle with this, and yeah, works really well. If I'm going to be doing a little bit of stitch in the ditch on my project, I might go and use the Glide thread, because that's what I'm using for all the rest of the project. But if I'm doing a lot of stitch in the ditch, I will use a nice fine matte thread, because the point of stitch in the ditch is that you don't see it, it just sort of disappears. My choices to do the stitch in the ditch, if I'm doing a lot of it, would be Invisifil, which is a really, really fine thread, or Bottom Line. They'd be the ones, if I was doing a lot of into the ditch, I would go to those first, and then swap up to my Glide to do the rest of my quilting. One thing you want to be really mindful of is make sure you pick up the right one. So don't just look at it and think, oh yeah, this says quilting thread. It's actually hand quilting thread. You can see it's a lot thicker, it's a lot coarser, and it's great for hand quilting, but not for machine quilting. You will have an absolute disaster. So just make sure that you do pick up the right type of thread. in that regard, Gutermann is a really nice construction thread. I love to use it when I'm making clothes or curtains and all sorts of things like that. It's not my favourite for quilting. I find that the stitches just sort of sit on the surface as opposed to embed into the fabric. So it wouldn't be my first choice for quilting. And it also works out quite expensive because when you get the big glide, you get 1,000 metres there for $10. And then you get on these little Gutermann, there's only, how many yards? 110 yards, which is not very much when you're quilting. And they're a fair few dollars before you go, and so you'd need several of them. So it's not a cheap way, and it's potentially not the best way. Now, this is a question I get asked all the time. Oh, but I've got all my mum's old threads, or I've got all my grandma's threads. I have too. They're in my jar and I think they look very pretty all together. And occasionally, if I see a colour, I think, oh, you know, here, hey, beautiful turquoise. I love that. My goodness me. It was made in Great Britain last century, I believe, by the look of it. Now, I might try it and see if it still works well, because thread does have a lifetime. If it really is a colour I want to try, I'll play with it for a little bit, but I won't invest a lot of time in it because, you know, if it's not going to work, it's not going to work. But sometimes I look through and I think, yeah, I want to use that colour, and I'm thinking about my grandma when I'm using it, and it's nice to do. But like I say, if it's not playing nicely in your machine, forget it. Don't worry about it for too long. Marking pens. In front of me, I've got a whole range of marking pens, predominantly from the Sewline company. I've been very happy with them in that their markers are made specifically for fabric, and I really haven't had any problems or issues with them. Though I would always say, whatever I say or anybody else says, test, 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 because you don't know what combination of fabric or pen you're using, and whether there's sizing in it, something else that might affect it. Always test what you've got. First things first, there's something that's very out of place here. It's this, the biro. Do keep your biros and everything else that you use to just draw on paper and what have you away from all your markers. It's far too easy to pick up the wrong one and draw on your quilt. We've had too many tears. We don't need any more tears on that one because because pretty much once it's on, it's on. So yeah, so just make sure you keep any normal pens away from your markers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I would mark up pattern fabric and what I would use, the same thing for dark fabric and the same thing for light fabric. And then you'll have a good idea of what's out there that you can play with, and these are the things that I use every day. We'll start with dark fabric. Any marker that you use, you should use as lightly as you possibly can, because the idea of a marker is it's there when you want it and it's gone as soon as possible. So I'm just going to go lightly on. That clearly marks the dark fabric. This is the same thing, except for it's got 3 colours. So it's got black, white and pink. So if I use the black, well, you obviously wouldn't be able to see it, but I'm just going to show you with the rubber on the end of the pen. Just comes off really easily. So this is a ceramic pencil that I use often on a dark fabric. This is another thing I might use on a dark fabric, which is a clover chalk marker. So it's like you might use them when you were dressmaking. So it creates a nice line. It is a bit chalky, but it does leave the line for you to use when you're going through doing quilting with rulers or whatever it might be. And then that again just rubs off. Pretty easily, and it also will come off with water too. This white one is fine. You can also get this marker in blue, yellow and grey. Now those colours are very, very strong and they stain really easily. So I actually don't recommend using those because I think they're just too strong. And you don't want marks left in your work. So that's what I would use on dark fabrics to make it show. The little quilt that I've got here is a class called Spinning Out, so you might want to check that one out as well. So I could use my ceramic markers and rub them off, and that's one option. I'll show you that on the dark fabric. Another option is the styler. This is called the styler, which is a blue pen, and it goes on nice and fine. I really like this one because it's got like a roller ball, so it doesn't dry out and it lasts a long time. Now this will come out with water. This is what they call the Aqua Eraser, and what this does is it has water. It's like a fountain pen. You just suck up the water inside the barrel, and then you can just take out your marks really easily, and that will dry and the marks will be gone. We do recommend, if you're going to just take out your marks like this, that once the project's finished, you wash it out in cold water. The thing about any blue pen, not just this one, is that you have to be mindful that not getting it hot. So no ironing, no leaving in a hot car, because they can then fix themselves in the fabric. So you need to remove those pen marks before you iron it. They're a really good option though if you've got to do a lot of marking on a quilt. A really good option for that, because then you can just dunk it in water and get rid of them all at once. Another one that I use heaps is this, is an air erasable pencil. So you know, it marks up really easily and it's very clear what you're doing, and it will air erase over time. It's what I marked this quilt up when I did it, and over a day or so they disappear. Now if you want to get rid of them quicker, you can actually go in with water, which looks a little bit scary but it does get rid of the marks a lot quicker as well. Yeah, so those will then fade away, and when that's dry, they'll be all good. These are the ones that I use heaps, and they're quite an economical way of doing the marking. This is a Soline Duo, which is really good. There's a little bit of a challenge with this one, is that it's probably not the most economical way, because the marker pen that you put on your mark on with first, so I've got the marker on, you probably let this last way longer than the remover. Now one way to make your remover last longer is just go very lightly. You don't need to scrub at it. See, I just lightly went over it and then that mark has disappeared. So they're pretty much like magic. You just don't need to, the thing to watch is not to scrub. So I'll show you that again. So you can draw whatever it is. And then I'm only very lightly. It doesn't go instantly, so you just don't think, oh, it's not gone, I'm going to have to scrub. You haven't, just very lightly, and that will go too. So there are different ways that you can mark on light fabrics as well. Pattern fabrics can be quite a challenge because there's so many colours in them and they're often quite a dense pattern, so depending what you're working on. So if you try a blue marker, it's great here, not so great here, not too bad there. So you can actually see it. The other thing you can use is the air erasable and see where's... That one might work better. Again, a little bit better, you can see it more on there, but not ideal. What you often end up doing on a pattern fabric is using a combination. So you might use a light pencil there, or the blue, and then you might use the duo marker, which will show up more. So it's very much a case on pattern fabric, you really have to multi-use your pens to help things show up. Just to let you know quickly here at the end, I am a Westler Design retailer, so if you're interested in quilting with rulers, there's heaps of information, blog posts and videos, as well as the actual products on my website, hillsidequilting.com.au. Finally, a shameless plug for the Tidy Tote, which is a pattern that I designed that keeps all your stuff all together. All these different things that you know you can use, you can now keep together inside your Tidy Tote. We have talked about heaps and heaps and heaps of things today, and like I said, you do have the notes that you can go over, and you can always get in touch with me via the website. All my contact details are on there too, so you don't have to remember all of it, and I really hope that you've enjoyed listening to me for the last hour nearly. So yeah, thank you ever so much for listening. We'll just take that out to questions now.